In question 21, we're presented with a lot of information, so I'm going to present it graphically. So we're told we have an animal cell, which is surrounded by a dilute glucose solution, so that will obviously contain water molecules and glucose molecules. And we're told there's a lower concentration of glucose in this glucose solution than there is within the cell cytoplasm. So the cell cytoplasm is a solution in its own right, with its own water and glucose molecules, and we're told there's a higher concentration in the cell cytoplasm than in this more dilute glucose solution. We're then told two very important facts: that there's net movement of glucose molecules into the cell, represented by these green arrows, and there's net movement of water molecules into the cell, which is the movement of these blue water molecules via these red arrows into the cell. So before we go any further, let's think about what's actually going on here. What different processes of cell transfer or movement across a membrane do you think these represent? So obviously there's diffusion, osmosis, active transport, facilitated diffusion. Which do you think is going on here? Well, there are a few clues on what's going on in this diagram. Well, if there's movement of glucose into the cell, well, we're going from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. So that's against a concentration gradient. And that should make you think of active transport, a process which uses ATP from respiration in order to move molecules against a concentration gradient, which they would naturally do via diffusion. Whereas in the case of our second type of movement, which is the movement of water molecules into the cell, well, that will be osmosis. We're going from an area of high to low water potential down a water potential gradient. Water potential, represented by the symbol psi, is an index of how free water molecules are to move. If we have a look at our diagram, we can see that in our more dilute solution, the water molecules have much more space to move around, whereas in this more densely packed, concentrated glucose solution in the cytoplasm, the water molecules are less free to move. So we have osmosis in the case of the water movement and active transport in the case of the glucose movement. Now let's get on to what the question's asking us, which is that a second identical cell is treated with a chemical inhibiting respiration and then is surrounded by the same glucose solution. So this time, no respiration. Which row in this table shows the effect of this chemical on the net movement of glucose and the net movement of water? So it's good to take each of these in turn. Let's start with the glucose. As we mentioned, the key fact here between the second cell and the first cell is that there's no respiration. As I mentioned, active transport uses energy from respiration. So there can't be active transport of glucose into the cell. So given our options in this table between glucose moving into the cell and not moving into the cell, it's clear that the glucose will not move into the cell because there's no energy to transport it against the concentration gradient. So A, C and E could be correct, and we can eliminate B, D and F. Let's move on to the water molecules. Now, in the case of the water molecules, osmosis does not require any respiration, it's just the passive movement down a water potential gradient. So since we have water moving in before, via osmosis, the water will move in again. And since A is the only option which has this out of A, C and E, my apologies, there was an error in the table at E and F. A is the only row that shows there's no net movement into the cell of glucose and there is net movement into the cell of water because there is no active transport and there is osmosis. So our answer is going to be option A.